There are moments in history where the silence is louder than the facts we are given. Dates, numbers, and official accounts can be arranged neatly on the page, yet behind that neatness lies a void, a space where something does not add up. This story begins inside one of those voids. Picture a cold morning in the year 1875. The sun has barely risen, and the railway platform at the edge of New York City is covered in a pale grey fog. The station master walks the length of the platform with a lantern in his hand. His boots click against the wooden planks. The mist is so thick he cannot see more than a few yards ahead. But then he hears it. Dozens of small voices, soft, nervous, whispering. When the fog clears, the station master freezes. Before him stand rows of children, more than 100 of them, some no older than 5, some perhaps 12 or 13. They stand in silence, clutching small bundles wrapped in cloth, staring ahead as if waiting for instructions. There is not a single adult among them. No parents, no guardians, no officials, only children. As he approaches, he asks the obvious questions. Where are your parents? Who brought you here? Where did you come from? But the answers never arrive. Some children lower their eyes, some hide their faces. Others attempt to speak but give only fragments. A few use words he does not recognize. A language that has no place in this part of the world. This was not an isolated event. Over the next decades, scenes like this took place again and again across the United States and Europe. Trains filled with children appeared in major cities, sometimes with minimal records, sometimes with none at all. History would later wrap these events in a simple explanation. The Orphan trains, a humanitarian effort meant to relocate abandoned or neglected youth from crowded cities to rural families who could care for them. But the numbers never truly made sense. More than 200,000 children were moved across the country. Many had no birth records. Many could not identify where they were from. Some carried memories that did not match any known town, city, or country. And some described places, machines, or buildings that should not have existed. It is here that the official story begins to crack. Not because the orphan train movement did not happen, it did, but because within that movement lies something that does not belong, a pattern hidden behind the statistics, a presence that resists explanation. When historians look back at these events, they focus on compassion, urban poverty, and the challenges of the industrial age. But they are silent about something else, the origin of these children. The sheer number of them, the uncanny consistency in the way they appeared, the strange memories they carried, and the way they sometimes behaved as if they had survived something vast, something devastating, something no child should ever witness. Some stories speak of children waking from nightmares, screaming about a great rumble under the earth. Others whisper of bright towers humming with light, cities made of white stone, sky after sky glowing with strange colours, and then a darkness, a wave, a collapse. None of it fits the world they lived in. None of it fits the timeline offered by our history. And yet these fragments return again and again. What were these children remembering? What world were they speaking of? And why did so many of them arrive without adults, as if they had survived something that removed the entire generation before them? Take a brief moment with me before we go further. Settle in, tap the like button if you are listening now, and let your mind open to what is coming next. Some of it may challenge the stories you grew up with. I would love to hear in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. And remember, the images you see here are simply visual companions to help shape the atmosphere. The heart of this story rests in the words themselves. Thank you for being here and for continuing this journey with us. As we travel deeper into this mystery, we find ourselves stepping into a larger and older question. A question many have attempted to answer and many more have tried to hide. This question is the shadow that hangs over everything that follows. What if these children were not simply orphans? What if they were the last survivors of a civilization that vanished from the record? There are maps from the 17th and 18th centuries that show a vast region spanning across Eurasia and into parts of North America. A region labelled with a single name, Tartaria. A civilization large enough to rival empires, a name that appears, then disappears, from the historical record with almost no explanation. According to official accounts, Tartaria was nothing more than a geographic label, a loose term for tribes and nomads, a convenient way for early cartographers to fill blank spaces. Yet the architecture, the engineering, and the structures left behind suggest something far more organized, something far more advanced. This contradiction is not small. It is the foundation of a mystery that stretches across continents. Today, most people have never heard the name Tartaria. The schoolbooks do not mention it. Museums do not display it. The historical narrative skips over it as if it never existed at all. And yet, the clues persist. Fragments of old cities with buried floors. Buildings that appear too grand for the populations recorded at the time. Structures that look more like relics from a different technological age than products of the last few centuries. But perhaps the most unsettling clues of all are not the buildings or the maps. They are the children. Children who appeared after disasters. Children who spoke of cities swallowed by mud. Children who said the adults had vanished. Children who drew towers and machines they should not have known. Children whose memories pointed toward a world older, brighter, and far more advanced than the one they had been brought into. These children came from somewhere. They belonged to someone, and their presence suggests that the line between recorded history and erased history is thinner than we are led to believe. As we step into this story, we must be willing to ask questions that challenge the foundations of what we think we know. We must be willing to follow a trail built not from textbooks, but from the voices of those who survived. This is the beginning of an investigation that reaches beyond the printed page, beyond the accepted timeline, beyond the world we are told is complete. This is the story of Tartaria's lost children and what history never told us. To understand the children, we must first understand the world they may have come from. Not the world recorded in our textbooks, but the world that existed in the blank spaces between them. A world that shows up in old maps, scattered documents, architectural remains, and whispered fragments of folklore. A world that once held its own place in the geography of empires, yet now exists only as a ghost of an idea. This world was Tartaria. Most people today have never heard the name. It has been reduced to a vague footnote, a forgotten label used by explorers and cartographers. But if one follows the trail of maps from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, a pattern emerges. Tartaria appears again and again, not as a small tribal region or a blank area to be filled later, but as a vast landmass stretching across Asia, Siberia, and sometimes into North America. A region so large that on certain maps it rivals the size of Russia or China, a region presented not as wilderness, but as an organized entity. And yet by the late 1800s, it vanishes almost completely from the historical record. The question is simple. How does a landmass that large, described in so many documents, disappear so quietly, without war, without collapse, without explanation? The disappearance is so total that even the name itself becomes suspicious, as if someone had deliberately lifted it out of the narrative. The deeper one looks, the stranger this disappearance becomes. There are architectural relics scattered across Europe, Asia, and the Americas that bear no resemblance to the technology or building style attributed to their supposed eras. Towering arches, cathedrals with impossible stonework, star-shaped fortifications, energy-like structures, and ornate civic buildings that seem far beyond the ability of the local population at the time they were supposedly built. Historians explain these structures by saying they were created by local rulers, by small colonial outposts, or by architects whose names have been lost, but many of these explanations feel unsatisfactory. The populations recorded at the time were small and lacked the workforce or technology for such colossal projects. In some cities, the official story claims these monumental buildings were constructed in only a few years, using materials and tools that do not match the precision of the finished structures. And then there is the question of energy. Several ancient illustrations and descriptions refer to towers, domes, spires, and metallic structures that seem designed for a purpose modern scholars cannot identify. Some researchers speculate that they were attempting to harness natural forces, perhaps atmospheric or electromagnetic energy. The most intriguing examples are buildings topped with metallic spheres, intricate antennas, or geometric shapes aligned with the Earth's magnetic field. These features appear to be more than decoration. They resemble components of an unknown system. This may sound speculative, and perhaps it is, but the consistency of these features across continents suggests a shared knowledge or a shared origin. The question then shifts from the structures themselves to the civilization that built them. Who were they? What technology did they possess? And why does the historical record remain silent about them? These anomalies hint at a civilization more advanced than its neighbours, and one deeply connected across vast distances. They hint at a global or semi-global culture with architectural standards, engineering skills, and energy concepts that appear more modern than ancient. They point to the possibility that Tartaria was not merely a geographic region, but a civilization. A civilization with shared knowledge, shared technologies, and perhaps even a shared worldview. Yet the official story insists on chaos, fragmentation, and tribal incoherence. This contradiction forms one of the many cracks in the facade of recorded history. The disappearance of Tartaria also aligns with another historical anomaly: the rapid rise of new nations, new empires, and new power structures across Eurasia during the 1700s and 1800s. It is as if the map was wiped clean, allowing new borders to be drawn on top of something older. Political shifts are common in history, but such a silent replacement is not. Another layer of this puzzle lies in language. Old documents reference languages or dialects associated with the Tartarian region that no longer exist or have no known root in modern tongues. Travellers recorded strange alphabets painted on buildings or carved into stone. Some reported hearing spoken languages that did not resemble Russian, Chinese, Mongolian, or any known linguistic group in the area. These accounts were dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerations. Yet the descriptions repeat across multiple sources. When combined with the architectural anomalies and the missing historical context, they begin to form a picture that is difficult to ignore. Then there is the question of population. If Tartaria was a civilization, it must have had millions of citizens. But census records from surrounding nations show strange gaps. Entire regions appear underpopulated or suddenly repopulated. Some records show a dramatic decrease in adult population during certain periods, while child population appears disproportionately large. These mismatches are often explained as clerical errors, war casualties, or migration. But taken together, they point towards something different: a sudden and unexplained loss, a void where a generation should exist, a silence where an entire civilization should have left its mark. This absence brings us back to the children, because if a civilization collapsed suddenly, if it was destroyed or wiped out by a great force of nature, a technological accident, or a cataclysm beyond understanding, the youngest members of that society would be the most likely to survive. Children often endure where adults do not, particularly in events involving environmental shifts, disease, or atmospheric anomalies. This possibility opens a path that connects the fragments. The children who appeared on platforms, in cities, and on trains in the late 1800s may not have been orphans in the traditional sense. They may have been displaced survivors of a civilization whose collapse is now hidden beneath layers of rewritten history. The question then becomes not only how Tartaria disappeared, but why its disappearance was never recorded. Civilizations do not vanish without reason. They collapse through war, famine, disease, or disaster. When they do, they leave behind artifacts, ruins, written accounts, and survivors. Yet Tartaria left behind almost none of these, as if its memory had been carefully erased. The silence surrounding Tartaria is not the silence of time. It is the silence of intention. A silence that suggests something was covered, removed, or rewritten. Something that threatened the narrative of the world that emerged afterward. What remains of Tartaria has been forced to survive in fragments, in buildings that do not match their timeline, in maps that contradict each other, in artifacts that defy explanation, and perhaps most significantly, in the memories of children who should not have known anything about it. If these children were indeed the last link to that world, then the true story of Tartaria has not been lost. It has simply been ignored. And now the question grows larger. What event could erase an entire civilization yet leave its children behind? This is where the story of Tartaria moves from the forgotten into the forbidden. And it brings us to the threshold of the event known as the Mud Flood. If Tartaria existed as more than a label on forgotten maps, then its disappearance would require an event powerful enough to bury cities, silence generations, and fracture the continuity of history itself. An event so vast that its traces would stretch across continents. An event not limited to one nation, but remembered in fragments by cultures oceans apart. That event has a name whispered in the borderlands between myth and scholarship. It is called the Mud Flood. To speak of it, we must set aside the image of a simple landslide or a seasonal washout. Those are common. They reshape hills, cover farmhouses, or swallow roads. But they do not bury entire cities in a matter of hours. They do not leave behind streets where only rooftops remain visible above hardened earth. They do not sink buildings so deeply that windows and doors, once at ground level, end up buried 1 or 2 stories beneath the surface. Yet this is exactly what is found in city after city when one looks beyond the accepted explanations. Consider Moscow in the early 1800s. Historians often highlight the fire of 1812, but the fire was only part of the story. Beneath the ashes, workers found layers of compacted earth, in some places thick enough to bury half of a building. Foundations meant to be visible were suddenly underground. Entire streets now lay several feet below the new surface. Some official records noted the phenomenon, then dismissed it as the result of chaotic construction, neglect, or erosion. But erosion does not bury entire districts in uniform layers of mud. It does not fill basements so thoroughly that doors and windows become archaeological relics. Across the Atlantic, similar anomalies appear. Chicago, in the mid to late 1800s, undertook a massive effort to raise its streets and buildings, lifting entire structures on jacks. The official story claims this was done to improve drainage. The narrative makes sense on the surface, but the depth of the buried layers raises questions. Some buildings had fully formed lower levels, complete with windows and decorated facades, now entirely underground. Why would architects construct elaborate features only to bury them immediately? Then there is Seattle, where reconstruction efforts in the 1800s revealed streets lying many feet below the current ones. The city eventually built elevated walkways, leaving the original streets entombed beneath. Examples continue in Europe, Asia, and India. In Kolkata, British engineers complained that certain marble doorways were found buried in dark, compact mud that seemed older than the buildings above it. In parts of Siberia, explorers recorded stone arches rising out of the ground like the ribs of a giant animal. the rest of the structure lost beneath layers of earth. Geologists often attribute these buried structures to floods, subsidence, or shifting soil. Yet these explanations do not account for the consistency of the phenomenon. They do not explain why similar layers appear across continents. They do not explain why these layers are often packed with fine sediment rather than debris. And they certainly do not explain why so many buildings appear to have been buried all at once rather than over centuries. To consider the mud flood seriously is to entertain the possibility of a rapid event, one that acted not over decades or years, but over days or hours. A sudden release of earth and water, perhaps triggered by seismic activity, atmospheric shifts, or something more unusual. Such an event would have been catastrophic, sweeping across vast regions, collapsing structures, and burying cities under a suffocating tide. What evidence would remain of such an event? The buried levels of buildings, the sudden appearance of uniform mud layers, the absence of adult survivors, and the presence of displaced populations in the decades that followed. There are also accounts, scattered through letters, diaries, and oral histories, that speak of strange weather during certain periods. Storms that brought not rain, but thick, heavy sediment. Skies that turned a colour never seen before. Thunder that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Some descriptions sound almost impossible. Witnesses described a rolling wave of soil advancing like liquid. Others spoke of vibrations in the ground that made buildings tremble long before the mud arrived. A few, whose accounts were later dismissed as madness, wrote of lights in the sky above the horizon, as if a silent storm of electricity hovered above the land. Whatever happened, it left behind a landscape that did not match the maps drawn only a generation before. This brings us to the most important clue of all, the absence of bodies. If a natural disaster had buried entire cities, the remains of the population should be found in the layers beneath. Yet excavation after excavation uncovers structures, artifacts, and foundations, but rarely the mass graves one would expect. The adults seem to be missing, gone. It is this absence that aligns so disturbingly with the arrival of the children. The timeline is too close to ignore. As buried cities were being rediscovered, children with unclear origins began appearing in large numbers. Some arrived in groups, some wandered into towns alone, some were found at the edges of newly formed mud banks, dazed and unable to explain where they came from. These coincidences would be easier to dismiss if not for the memories some of these children carried. Memories of trembling ground, of a deep rumbling, of a wall of earth rising from the horizon and sweeping toward their homes. Memories of parents calling out, then disappearing in a roar of darkness. Memories of being lifted, pushed, or thrown clear of something that swallowed everything behind them. A few spoke of seeing an entire city sink, not slowly, but all at once, as if the earth had opened its jaws beneath it. Such stories were dismissed as nightmares, trauma, or childish imagination, yet the consistency of these accounts across regions and languages suggests something else, something that these children had truly seen. If the mud flood was real, and if it struck at a scale large enough to devastate an entire civilization, then it may explain the disappearance of Tartaria, not through war, not through conquest, but through a moment of overwhelming force. It might also explain why only the children remained. Adults are less resilient in disasters involving environmental shifts, atmospheric anomalies, or sudden collapses. Children, though vulnerable, sometimes survive events that older bodies cannot endure. What we have then is a pattern, a catastrophe powerful enough to bury architecture under meters of earth. A timeline that coincides with the disappearance of adults across vast regions. The sudden appearance of thousands of children with no clear origin, and a silence in the historical record large enough to conceal an entire civilization. This silence is the shadow of the mud flood, a shadow that stretches across the next part of our story. Because if the mud flood buried Tartaria, It did not bury everything. Something remained. Something survived. Something that would reshape the history we think we know. And those survivors were the children. The mud flood alone cannot explain the strangest part of this story. Buried cities can be understood. Natural disasters can be studied. Architecture can be dated and analysed. But one element continues to resist interpretation no matter how deeply one looks. Where did the adults go? The question echoes across continents and across records. A disaster powerful enough to collapse a civilization should leave behind signs of its victims. Graves, bones, written testimonies, remains preserved in the layers of earth that settled after the event. This is how history has always revealed the tragedies of the past. But here, the pattern breaks. Archaeologists uncover buildings, but not bodies. They uncover tools, pottery, foundations, and metalwork, but rarely the remains of the populations who built them. In some places, explorers have noted that entire levels of cities appear abandoned, as if the inhabitants vanished before the earth came down upon them. In others, structures appear to have been in use moments before being overtaken by mud, yet there is no sign of those who lived inside. This absence is more disturbing than the mud itself. If a civilization the size of Tartaria collapsed, there should be evidence of its people. Millions of individuals do not simply disappear without a trace, and yet that is what the record suggests. Adult populations in vast regions decline suddenly in the decades surrounding the mud flood events. Census records from nearby nations show sharp decreases in workforce numbers. Military rosters thin. Tax records evaporate. Towns appear in maps yet have barely any recorded inhabitants. Then, in the decades after, these same regions show a sudden rise in child populations. It is a pattern as strange as it is consistent. To historians, these anomalies are typically dismissed as clerical errors, inconsistent record-keeping, or the result of migration. But the sheer scale of these mismatches surpasses any simple explanation. The absence is too large, too synchronized, too complete. Something removed the adults, not gradually, but suddenly. Not geographically isolated, but across massive territories. Not through slow decline, but through an event that left almost no physical evidence of their passing. This raises the possibility of a silent reset, a moment in history where the world changed so drastically that only those young enough, small enough, or physically resilient enough survived. Events involving suffocating dust, atmospheric changes, toxic gas, seismic bursts, or pressure waves might target adults more severely than children. Certain natural or technological catastrophes can affect bodies differently depending on size, lung capacity, or even metabolic speed. If the mud flood was not merely earth and water, but part of a larger sequence of environmental anomalies, this could begin to explain the disappearance. There are accounts written in old letters that describe strange sensations in the air during certain disasters. Sensations like ringing in the ears that would not stop. A low-frequency vibration that made the chest tighten. A pressure that felt like the air itself was being squeezed. In one case, a traveller wrote that he felt as if his lungs were being crushed by an invisible hand, while children around him seemed untouched. Such descriptions are rare, but they exist, and their implications are unsettling. Adults might have succumbed to something children could withstand. A wave of pressure, a shift in the air, a resonance that affected larger bodies more intensely. This concept might sound speculative, but there are modern parallels. Certain sound frequencies can cause nausea, collapse, or even internal injury. High concentrations of gases can overwhelm adult lungs faster than those of children, and environmental pressure changes can affect larger bodies with greater severity. If such an event occurred across a large region, it could wipe out the adult population of a civilization in a short period of time. But this explanation, while possible, opens the door to another question. Why would such an event target adults? Was it entirely natural, or was it the accidental consequence of something far more complex? Some researchers have suggested the possibility of a technological accident. If Tartaria possessed large energy systems, atmospheric devices, or electrical towers, as some architectural remains suggest, then a malfunction or overload could have created a wave of destructive force. A collapse of such a system might produce the kind of pressure, sound, or energy release that could devastate a population. Others consider a different possibility, that the event was not accidental, that it was intentional. A reset brought about by those who sought to remove an existing civilization to make room for their own. If this sounds too conspiratorial, consider the scale of societal transformation that occurred in the 1800s. Nations rose and fell, borders were redrawn, political powers shifted, entire worldviews changed, and woven through this transformation was a disappearance so large that it became invisible. The silence surrounding the event is perhaps the greatest clue. History records wars, plagues, fires, and revolutions, yet it says almost nothing about the disappearance of millions of people across Eurasia. The silence is not natural. It suggests omission, redaction, or deliberate rewriting. If the adults were removed in a single catastrophic moment, then the children became the only survivors, the only witnesses, the only remnants of a world that had ceased to exist. This brings us back to the strange appearance of children in distant cities. If scattered across continents, disoriented and traumatized, they would have no way to explain what had happened. They would not be able to articulate the collapse of their world. Their memories would appear fragmented, dreamlike, or incoherent, and so they would be absorbed into the societies that found them. In time, their memories would fade, their origins forgotten, their past rewritten. The adults who took them in would never know the truth about where they came from. The institutions that processed them would assume abandonment or neglect. The official story would take shape around a narrative of charity, migration, and social reform. But beneath that narrative lies a different story, a story of the last children of Tartaria, children who survived a catastrophe that erased their civilization, children whose memories would become the final clues to a world buried under mud and silence. If this interpretation is correct, then the disappearance of adults is not simply a historical anomaly. It is the central event that binds all the fragments together: the buried architecture, the missing records, the sudden rise of orphan populations, the architectural marvels that no longer fit their timelines, and the silence in the historical record all converge on this moment. A moment when the world reset itself, a moment when an entire civilization vanished, except for its children, and those children would soon be gathered, transported, and scattered once again in what history now calls the orphan trains. If a great disaster truly swept across the old world, erasing adults and leaving only the youngest survivors, then the question becomes clear. What happened to those children afterward? How did the world absorb them? How did nations explain their sudden appearance? And how did a generation raised without memory of their homeland become woven silently into the fabric of modern history? For this part of the story, we turn to the orphan trains. Most history lessons frame the orphan train movement as an act of compassion. Between 1854 and 1929, thousands of children were placed on trains in eastern cities and sent across the American Midwest. The goal, we are told, was to rescue abandoned and neglected youth from crowded streets and give them new homes with rural families. The narrative is clean, simple, and moral. But as we look deeper, it becomes clear that the story contains too many inconsistencies for comfort. More than 200,000 children were transported across the United States during this period. Some trains carried 30 or 40 children. Others carried more than 100. They travelled in long lines of carriages, accompanied by a few officials or no officials at all. The children disembarked at small towns where families gathered to select them. Some were adopted, others were taken on as workers. Many never saw each other again. Yet one detail stands out above all others. The origins of a significant number of these children were never recorded. Many arrived without birth certificates. Some did not know their surnames. Others gave stories that did not match any known place. And a few, whose accounts were later dismissed as fantasies, described having come from cities no one could identify. These children were not merely orphans, they were children without a past. Official explanations insist that poverty, disease, and urban crowding produced these children, but the numbers remain suspiciously high, too high. The scale of the phenomenon suggests something else, a population that appeared suddenly with too many unknown origins and too many missing families. It is here that the possibility arises that some of these children were not born in the cities that launched the orphan trains. They may have arrived there by other means, carried by events no one could explain, placed in orphanages because there was nowhere else for them to go. There are accounts from caretakers and station workers who describe children who looked disoriented, as if they had recently endured something catastrophic. Some spoke in unfamiliar accents. Some repeated names of towns that could not be found on maps. Others drew pictures of tall white towers, arched bridges, and wide plazas decorated with symbols no one recognized. One caretaker recalled a boy who repeatedly asked when his parents would return from the shining city across the water. Another described a girl who insisted she had come from a place where the houses were built from smooth stone that glowed at night. A third remembered a child who spoke of a rumbling sound that shook the sky and made the ground rise up like a wave. These stories were written off as the fantasies of traumatized youth. But taken together, they suggest something more. They suggest that some of the children carried memories of a world that no longer existed. If the mud flood had destroyed Tartaria, and if adult populations had vanished, then the children who survived might have struggled to explain their origins. They would have been found wandering near the edges of collapsed regions, dazed, hungry, and alone. Officials of the time, unfamiliar with any disaster of such scale, would have assumed abandonment or migration. The children would have been placed in orphanages, reclassified, renamed, and eventually sent out into the world as part of the orphan train system. In this sense, the orphan trains become more than a social movement. They become a mechanism through which the remnants of a lost civilization were redistributed across a new world. Another strange detail emerges from written accounts. Some of the children arrived wearing clothing that did not match local fashions. Their garments contained stitching patterns unknown to seamstresses of the time. A few wore metallic ornaments or small trinkets that officials confiscated without explanation. Many of these items disappeared into private collections or government archives. There were also reports of children with unusual knowledge. One boy in Ohio could describe in detail the workings of a large tower that collected energy from the air, though he did not know how he knew this. A girl in Kansas drew a map of a city with concentric rings and canals, a design that would not appear in American engineering for decades. Another child sketched a complex geometric symbol repeatedly, claiming it had once been carved onto the door of her home. Stranger still were the dreams. Caregivers noted that many children shared nightmares of shaking ground, falling buildings, and a tide of earth sweeping across their homes. Some awoke screaming that the adults had been taken by the sky. Others whispered of a great flash, followed by silence. These shared dreams tie directly into the memories described earlier. They are echoes of a world swallowed by catastrophe. If the children truly were survivors of Tartaria, their memories would have been the final trace of that civilization. But memory is fragile. Traumatic experiences fracture it, new surroundings overwrite it, and as the children grew older, most of their early recollections faded, replaced by the routines of their new lives. Yet some memories remained. Isolated fragments, strange images, a sense of having come from somewhere else. a feeling that the world they were raised in was not entirely their own. The orphan trains scattered these children across thousands of miles. They were raised by different families, lived in different towns, and adopted different identities. Their pasts dissolved into the machinery of a rapidly changing world. Their stories became footnotes, misfiled documents, or private secrets whispered only in old age. But a pattern still emerges, a pattern too large to ignore. A sudden disappearance of adults, a sudden rise in abandoned children, a massive relocation effort disguised as charity, and memories of a civilization erased from the record. This is why the orphan trains matter. They are not just a historical event, they are a bridge between two worlds. A bridge between the world that ended and the world that followed. A bridge built by the children who survived. And as we follow these children through the scattered fragments of their early lives, we begin to enter the quiet rooms of their memory. The images they carried lingered beneath the identities given to them, beneath the new names and the new histories assigned by the societies that absorbed them. Their memories surfaced in drawings, in whispered stories, in dreams they could not escape. Through them, a lost world flickers back to life, a world that should not have existed, yet refused to vanish entirely. For the truth of Tartaria may be found not in ruins or in maps, but in the memories of its last sons and daughters. Memories are the last things to fade. Long after names are forgotten, long after languages shift, long after the structures of a vanished world are ground into dust, memory holds on. It clings to the mind like the final echo of a voice carried through time. And in the case of the children we have followed through this story, their memories form the most haunting evidence of all. These memories do not appear in official records. They surface instead in journals written decades later, in interviews given at the end of life, in sketches found tucked between pages of old books, and in whispered stories preserved by the descendants of those children. Taken individually, such memories could be dismissed as imagination, but taken together, they form a pattern too consistent, too vivid, and too impossible to ignore. If the children were truly survivors of Tartaria, their memories would be the final window into that lost world. Many of these memories share the same imagery: a city made of white stone, spires that rose into the sky, towers capped with metallic shapes that glimmered even without sunlight, bridges that curved like ribbons across wide canals, streets lined with symmetrical arches, buildings that hummed softly as if singing from within. One man, adopted into a family in Nebraska, described in his old age a dream he had throughout his childhood. He said he remembered standing on a wide platform of smooth stone, watching a tall tower pulse with a warm glow. He did not know what powered it, but he remembered the vibration beneath his feet. He said the air felt alive. Another child, a girl sent to a farm in Missouri, spent her early years drawing the same image again and again: a circular plaza with a perfectly shaped dome in the center. Around it were thin metallic rods rising from the ground, each topped with a small sphere. Visitors to the farm assumed she had seen a picture somewhere, but no one knew what she was actually remembering. Years later, her drawings were compared with photographs of old Tartarian-style architecture. The likeness was striking. Then there were the auditory memories, children who claimed to remember a low hum echoing through the streets, a soft, continuous sound that came from structures themselves. One boy described the sound as a gentle ringing that changed pitch throughout the day. Another said the air had a strange quality, like it carried a subtle vibration. Such descriptions have no parallel in the 1800s. Nothing in that era produced these effects. But the memories continued. The most haunting memories, however, came from the days of the collapse. These accounts, fragmented and dreamlike, were filled with fear and confusion. Some children remembered a brightness in the sky. Others remembered a feeling of pressure, like the air was being squeezed. A few spoke of an immense rumble from the earth, deep and resonant, unlike thunder or earthquake. One former orphan, interviewed in 1932, said that his earliest memory was of the ground moving like a wave beneath him. He described adults around him shouting in panic, pointing toward the horizon. He remembered seeing a wall of earth rising, rolling forward with terrible speed. He was no older than 5 at the time. Another, who later became a school teacher, recalled waking in the middle of the night to a faint ringing in the walls of her home. She said the adults told her to run, but before she could reach them, everything went dark. She woke days later in a different place, alone. These memories, though scattered and incomplete, align with the idea of a sudden and violent event, a catastrophe capable of swallowing cities and erasing entire generations. There are also memories that touch on the disappearance of adults. Children recalled moments where their parents were simply gone. Some described seeing them collapse. Others said they vanished in the blink of an eye, though such imagery may be the mind trying to make sense of trauma. Still, the consistency is eerie. One account stands out. A boy adopted by a family in Colorado remembered crawling into a cellar during the shaking. He recalled his mother pushing him inside, telling him to hide. When he emerged, the house was half buried, and he could no longer find her. He wandered for days until he was found by travelers who assumed he was an abandoned child. Another child remembered being carried by an older sibling as the ground shook and structures fell. He said the air felt heavy and he struggled to breathe. He recalled his sibling telling him not to look up. When he finally opened his eyes again, he was alone in a field of mud. These accounts share the same emotional tone, a mixture of terror, confusion, and a sense of being separated from the world they knew. But beyond the destruction, beyond the terror, there are moments of calm. Some memories depict a world of beauty and harmony, a world where structures were aligned with the land, a world of clean water channels, bright plazas, and architecture that seemed to blend seamlessly with nature. A world that felt coherent, intentional, and peaceful. One man described it as a place where the buildings themselves seemed to breathe, a place where the wind carried a soft melody, a place where light seemed to have a warmer colour. These memories stand in stark contrast to the world the children were brought into. For a young mind, the transition must have been overwhelming. Imagine experiencing a world of white cities and humming towers, only to awaken in a crowded orphanage of brick and smoke, surrounded by people who could not understand your language or your memories. It is no wonder the children withdrew, retreated into silence, or repressed the memories until adulthood. Even more remarkable are the shared symbols. In numerous sketches, children drew patterns resembling geometric mandalas, spirals, or intricate knots. Some of these resemble energy diagrams found in old manuscripts. Others appear similar to the decorative designs carved into Tartarian-style buildings. The repetition of these symbols across children in different regions, with no contact with one another, is difficult to explain. The memories were fragments, pieces of a world that had been lost floating in the minds of the smallest survivors. Yet together they form a mosaic, and that mosaic shows a civilization advanced in ways not reflected anywhere in official history. A civilization whose architecture, energy, and knowledge left deeper impressions on the minds of its children than any textbook acknowledges. A civilization whose final moments scarred a generation too young to understand what they had witnessed. As the memories faded, the children grew into new identities. Their past lives dissolved into dreamlike images. But the echoes remained, and those echoes form the backbone of this forgotten world. For in the minds of these children lies the clearest image we have of Tartaria before its fall. If the children carried the memories, and the mud flood left the physical scars, then the next question becomes unsettling. What happened to the ruins of the old world? Where did the remains of Tartaria's architecture go? How were such vast structures erased from history with so little trace left behind? To find the answer, We turn not to ruins buried in mud or abandoned cities in distant lands, but to something far more public. Something that millions of visitors saw with their own eyes. Something that was shown proudly, celebrated loudly, and then destroyed completely. The world's fairs. Between the mid-1800s and the early 1900s, cities around the world hosted grand expos that dazzled the public with enormous buildings, intricate designs, towering domes, and elaborate plazas. These structures were presented as temporary constructions, built quickly to celebrate culture and industry. They were described as a triumph of modern engineering. Cities like Chicago, Paris, St. Louis, and San Francisco competed to outdo one another, erecting entire districts in a matter of months. But the deeper one looks, the stranger these fairs appear. Consider the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, often called the White City. The fairgrounds spanned hundreds of acres, filled with shimmering white structures, palaces, colonnades, arches, and domes. Each building exhibited a level of detail and craftsmanship difficult to achieve even today. Yet the official story states that many of these buildings were made of temporary materials like plaster and wood. According to the narrative, they were built in just 2 years, displayed for a single season, and then demolished entirely. Yet the architecture looks ancient, monumental, and in many ways too perfect to be temporary. Visitors of the time described entering the White City and feeling as though they had stepped into another world. The scale, the symmetry, and the harmony of the buildings left them in awe. Some wrote that the structures felt old, as though they belonged to a forgotten era rather than the modern age. Reporters marveled at how entire palaces rose from the ground almost overnight, and then, as soon as the fair ended, these palaces were torn down, burned, exploded, dismantled, all within a few months. Why destroy something so extraordinary? The answer given is simple. They were temporary, too expensive to maintain, and never meant to last. But this explanation does not match the visual evidence. Temporary buildings do not possess the architectural detail seen in photographs of the world's fairs. They do not feature marble-like facades, carved reliefs, intricate domes, and massive columns that rival the architecture of ancient civilizations. Something else stands out. The buildings at the fairs often resemble the structures described in the memories of the orphan children. White stone, grand plazas, energy like towers topping rooftops, domes that looked more functional than decorative. It is as if the fairs were a reenactment not of the future, but of the past. A reconstruction of Tartaria disguised as modern innovation. The deeper one examines the timelines, the more suspicious they become. Many fairgrounds were said to have been built in record time with limited labour, using primitive tools by today's standards. And yet the results resemble the work of master architects using advanced techniques. In many cases, the designs match older structures buried in Europe and Asia, structures that historians claim belong to different cultures with no connection to one another. Why do buildings from Chicago 1893 echo architecture seen in old drawings of Siberia? Why do domes in St. Louis resemble towers in Central Asia? Why does the layout of San Francisco's 1915 exposition mirror the geometric design of older Tartarian fortresses? The connections are too precise to be coincidence. Then comes the most telling detail of all. After each fair ended, the destruction was total. Photographs show dynamite charges placed at the bases of domes and arches, fires deliberately set to consume entire palaces. Even buildings constructed from stone, not plaster, were removed as if their existence posed a threat. These fairs may not have been built from scratch. They may have been built on top of something older. They may have been a way to reveal the remnants of Tartaria temporarily, letting the world marvel at them one last time before they were removed from sight forever. But why reveal them at all? Perhaps the fairs served a transitional purpose. a way to rewrite history in real time. By presenting the architecture as modern, temporary, and the result of industrial progress, the organisers could shift attention away from the deeper truth. They could claim ownership of the structures, recast them as inventions of the new world rather than relics of the old. Visitors would see the buildings, admire them, photograph them, and leave believing that this was the future of architecture, not the past. Then, once the illusion was set, the structures could be destroyed, leaving no trace of their original origins. It is here that the evidence becomes even more unsettling. Some World's Fair buildings were not built at all. They were discovered, cleaned, modified, and presented under a new narrative. Reports from construction workers mention older foundations beneath the fairgrounds. Workers described finding stone floors and buried walls that did not match the designs they were supposedly constructing. In one case, a crew in Chicago reported finding a massive hollow chamber beneath the site, filled with rubble and dust, as though a building had been buried there long before the fair began. These discoveries were not made public. They were quietly noted, then erased from the official record. Architects at the time also expressed doubts. Some wrote that they were astonished by how fast their teams were able to complete the work. Others hinted that they were instructed to follow pre-existing lines and foundations. One even suggested that the designs were not original, but inspired by older plans whose origins were unclear. Taken together, these fragments form a chilling possibility. The World's Fairs may have been the final act of a cover-up, a brief unveiling of Tartaria's architecture under a different name before the remains of that world were wiped away. This would explain the haste, the destruction, the secrecy, and the strange resemblance between the fairgrounds and the memories of the orphan children. For if the children remembered white cities, humming towers, and monumental plazas, then the fairs were the closest the world came to seeing those cities again. Not as ancient marvels, but as temporary spectacles. And once the world accepted that these structures were new, the past could be buried with them. Their origins faded behind the smoke of demolition charges, behind the official stories, behind the noise of modern progress. But the remnants of the old world were not finished speaking. In the years that followed, something happened that broke through the silence. Something violent enough to rip open the ground and expose what had been hidden beneath it. It struck a city built on unusual architecture, a place where strange foundations and unexplained structures already lay concealed under its streets. When the catastrophe unfolded, it did more than destroy buildings. It peeled back the layers of time and revealed bones, artifacts, and chambers that did not belong to the age in which they were found. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 tore through the city like a blade, and in the ruins left behind, the earth offered a glimpse of a forgotten world. What emerged from beneath the rubble forced those who saw it to question everything they believed about the land they lived on, the history they were taught, and the civilization that had once stood where the modern city stood now. When the morning of April 18, 1906, arrived in San Francisco, it carried with it one of the most violent natural disasters in American history. The earthquake shattered buildings, ruptured roads, and set the city ablaze for days. Most people today remember the disaster for the destruction it caused above ground. But the true mystery of San Francisco lay beneath the ruins, because when the city collapsed, it exposed something far older than the quake itself. Firefighters, rescue teams, and soldiers were deployed across the city. They pulled survivors from broken houses and searched beneath fallen stone. But in several districts, workers stumbled upon something they could not explain. Beneath layers of collapsed structures, beneath what should have been simple foundations, they found rooms that did not match the recorded architecture of the city. Lower floors, staircases leading downward, archways filled with compact soil, and chambers that looked ancient. Then they found the bones, not scattered, not in cemeteries, but buried in places where no bodies should have been. The first reports came from the workers clearing rubble near the waterfront. They uncovered a cavity beneath a collapsed warehouse, its walls lined with bricks far older than the building above. Inside were skeletal remains clothed in garments that did not match the early 1900s. The fabric was tightly woven, unfamiliar in pattern, and the stitching resembled craftsmanship not used in America at the time. The bones themselves were in a state of preservation that baffled local coroners. Some appeared centuries old, others far more recent. But the true anomaly came from the clothing. One garment contained metallic threads embedded in the fabric, something no tailor in the region knew how to produce. Another contained a small palm-sized object made of metal, carved with a spiral pattern. When examined, the object emitted a faint ringing sound when struck, as if resonating at a specific frequency. Officials confiscated it immediately. Similar discoveries followed. On Rincon Hill, a group of workers found a section of wall buried deep beneath the surface. Carved into the stone was a symbol, a circle crossed by lines radiating outward, resembling a stylized sun or energy diagram. The wall did not match the known architectural styles of the period, nor did it match the styles of the Spanish, Mexican, or American buildings that had occupied the area. It looked older, much older. One worker who witnessed the discovery years later said that the wall looked as though it belonged to a different world, a world of perfect geometry and unusual precision. Before anyone could study it, the area was cleared and the wall was quietly removed. But the most startling find occurred in the district near Market Street. Deep below the rubble, workers uncovered a room with a high arched ceiling, its upper half collapsed by the quake. The lower half, however, remained intact. Inside they found two human skeletons laid out side by side, as if intentionally placed. Their clothing was unfamiliar, made from materials that appeared both simple and advanced at once. The cut of the garments was not European, not Asian, not American. The style had no known equivalent. When coroners examined the remains, they estimated the bones to be at least 200 years old, possibly more. Yet the room in which they were found was far below the level of modern construction, as if it had been built before the city of San Francisco even existed. The discovery was never made public. Newspapers did not report it. The city records are silent. But fragments of testimony survive in private letters, journals, and accounts given by the workers themselves. And these fragments reveal a disturbing pattern. Whenever an anomaly was found, whether bones, artifacts, or structural remains, government officials or private agents arrived quickly. They confiscated the objects, sealed the area, and instructed workers to remain silent. Some workers were told that they had misinterpreted what they saw. Others were threatened with dismissal. A few simply left the city afterward, unwilling to remain in a place where the ground itself seemed dishonest. There was also the matter of the tunnels. As the cleanup continued, workers found a network of underground passages that ran beneath parts of the city. Some were brick-lined, others carved into stone. Many led nowhere. Others led to chambers filled with dirt and debris. None appeared on official city plans. Old legends claimed that the earlier settlers found unusual structures beneath San Francisco, buildings and fortifications older than any documented civilization in the region. Historians dismiss these stories as frontier imagination. But the findings of 1906 gave new weight to the legends. One tunnel contained a staircase that descended deeper than the workers expected. The lower steps were filled with hardened mud, as if a flood of earth had poured into the passage long ago. When workers attempted to dig further, officials intervened and sealed the area. What were these underground structures? Why were they buried long before the city was built above them? And why did they contain human remains wearing clothing from a time and culture that does not fit the recorded history of the region? This is where the link to Tartaria becomes impossible to ignore. Across Eurasia, buried structures show the same patterns: lower levels filled with mud, architecture of unknown origin, symbols carved in stone, and artifacts made of metals that resonate at strange frequencies. The findings in San Francisco fit this pattern too well to be coincidence. If Tartaria had been a widespread civilization, spanning continents, then its architecture may have existed in places we do not associate with it today. If parts of the world experienced the same mud flood event, then structures around the globe could have been buried at the same time. If adults disappeared and only children survived, then the remains found beneath San Francisco may belong not to the city's founders, but to people from a different world entirely. But there is another possibility, a darker one. The artifacts and bones found in 1906 may not have been native to San Francisco at all. They may have been transported there by the same forces that displaced the children, carried across oceans by the disaster that erased Tartaria, later buried beneath centuries of mud, and revealed only when the quake tore the city open. The timing is important. The quake and fire destroyed large parts of the city, erasing old evidence while accidentally exposing new evidence beneath. It was a moment of revelation and concealment happening simultaneously. Officials may have seen the same pattern. They may have recognized the danger in allowing the public to know that beneath the streets lay architecture older than the city itself. That bones older than the state of California had been found in chambers that no one could explain. That artifacts existed which did not belong to any known culture. The cover-up would have been simple. The city was already in chaos. Records burned. People died. Entire districts vanished in flames. Amid such destruction, it would have been easy to hide discoveries that challenged the established timeline. The few accounts that survived speak of confusion, secrecy, and a sense that something was deeply wrong beneath the city. One worker wrote that he felt as though he had glimpsed a world buried beneath his own, a world with a different history entirely. The quake revealed the shadows of Tartaria, but the shadows were hidden again just as quickly. The next chapter of this story takes us away from ruins and into legend, into a tale of two children who appeared in a village centuries ago, speaking a strange language and claiming to come from a land without sunlight. Their story may hold the key to how the children of Tartaria survived. History is filled with stories that hover in the space between myth and memory, tales that are dismissed as folklore, yet contain details too unusual, too specific, and too persistent to be ignored. Among these stories, one stands out as a possible echo of a world now lost. A story that may point toward the survival of children after a great catastrophe, long before the orphan trains appeared. It is the tale of the green children of Woolpit. According to accounts recorded in the 12th century, two children appeared one day on the outskirts of the English village of Woolpit. They were found near a set of deep earthworks known as the Wolf's Pits. They wore unusual clothing, spoke a language no one recognized, and their skin carried a faint green tint. The villagers were shocked, yet took the children in. Over the following days, the children gradually learned to speak English. They told an extraordinary story. They said they came from a place where the sun never shone, a land of perpetual twilight, a place separated from this world by a vast barrier. They claimed they had followed a herd of animals into a cavern and lost their way, eventually emerging into the bright world above. The brightness frightened them, the sounds overwhelmed them, and they collapsed near Woolpit, exhausted and disoriented. Historians interpret the tale as fantasy or misremembered folklore, but the details strike a deeper chord when viewed through the lens of the Tartarian mystery. What if the green children were not mythical? What if they were early examples of the same phenomenon that would later bring thousands of children across oceans and continents? The similarities are unsettling. The green children appeared suddenly, without parents, speaking an unknown language. They described a place that did not fit the geography of Earth as we know it. Their story contains elements of underground passages, lost realms, and disconnection from the surface world. It carries echoes of displacement, trauma, and the struggle to adapt to a new environment. The villagers noted that the children seemed confused by basic things: the sun, the warmth, the colours of the landscape. They behaved as if they had emerged from another world, and yet with time they adapted. Their skin returned to normal colour. They learned the local language. One of them survived into adulthood. This pattern resembles what many orphan-trained children experienced centuries later: disorientation, loss of memory, and eventual assimilation. The story of the green children is not unique. Across Europe and Asia, tales exist of children who appeared from nowhere, wandering alone, speaking strange languages. Some were said to come from underground cities, others from realms beyond the edges of maps. In one Russian account, a group of children emerged from a cavern in the Ural Mountains, wearing clothing embroidered with unfamiliar symbols. Local villagers believed they had survived a collapse beneath the earth. In China, legends tell of children appearing after earthquakes, claiming to come from a world beneath the rivers. Over time, these stories were folded into mythology, yet their common themes suggest something more concrete: the survival of children after a hidden catastrophe. If Tartaria truly existed as a widespread civilization, it may have included both surface cities and subterranean structures. The existence of underground tunnels, chambers, and buried architecture uncovered in modern times supports this idea. A civilization built across such a vast region would have needed networks for transportation, storage, or refuge. If these subterranean systems existed, then during a cataclysm, such as the mud flood or the collapse of an energy system, some children may have found their way into these spaces. They may have wandered through darkness and emerged miles away, separated from their families, unable to return. Other children may have survived in isolated pockets, cut off from the surface for years. Their bodies could have changed slightly due to lack of sunlight, as in the case of the green children. This would explain their strange appearance and shock upon encountering daylight again. In this context, the green children's story becomes more than folklore. It becomes a trace of an event that predates the known collapse, a clue that suggests Tartaria experienced disasters before its final destruction. Perhaps earlier mud floods or partial resets forced small groups of children to escape through underground passages. These early survivors would have remained hidden from history, remembered only in whispered tales. There is another detail worth noting. When questioned, the green children said their homeland was separated from this world by a river of light. Some interpret this as metaphor, but it may have been their attempt to describe a barrier, possibly an atmospheric anomaly or energy field associated with Tartarian technology. If Tartaria truly harnessed energy through towers, domes, and resonant structures, then disruptions in this system might have created distortions in the environment, confusing those who lived near such places. If the children passed through a region affected by such distortions, their sense of direction or perception of the world might have been altered. This could explain why they believed they had crossed into another realm. The core of the story holds something powerful. Children survived, adults vanished, and the world they came from could not be found. This is exactly the pattern that would repeat centuries later. When the mud flood struck in the 1800s and structures collapsed across continents, children appeared in towns and cities speaking unfamiliar languages and drawing strange shapes. When the earthquake hit San Francisco, the bones found beneath the rubble belonged to people whose clothing and tools did not match the time period. The green children represent the earliest recorded instance of this phenomenon. Their story did not begin in the 1800s. It began long before. It suggests that Tartaria may have suffered cycles of upheaval, with each disaster pushing survivors into the world above. Survivors who, over time, became separated from their origins and absorbed into local populations. The folklore also contains a haunting detail. In several versions of the story, The children said their parents did not survive whatever event forced them into the cavern. This echoes the accounts from the Orphan trains, where children remembered the moment the adults disappeared. It is the same story, told centuries apart, different places, different children, same pattern. If we follow these threads, we begin to see a lineage of survival stretching across history. A lineage not preserved in textbooks or official records, but in the memories, drawings, and whispered tales of children scattered throughout the world. The green children were the first sign, the orphan train children were the last. Between them lies the story of how an entire civilization faded into legend, leaving behind only echoes of its existence. And those echoes lead us now into the deeper question. If Tartaria fell, who rebuilt the world in its place? Who benefited from the reset? And what forces ensured that the truth would never be widely known? We approach those questions in the next part of this journey. Every mystery has a point where the questions become too large to ignore. For Tartaria, that point arrives here. Everything we have uncovered so far leads to a single, unavoidable thought. If an entire civilization vanished, if adults disappeared across continents, and if children were scattered into new societies, then something or someone must have been behind the event. Civilizations do not erase themselves. Cities do not bury themselves. Histories do not rewrite themselves without guidance. The idea of a great reset is not new. The phrase appears in old manuscripts, sometimes in religious context, sometimes in poetic form. It suggests a moment when the world is wiped clean, not by time, but by force. A moment when what existed before becomes so inconvenient to the new order that it must be removed. For Tartaria, the reset was almost total. The physical structures were buried under mud. The architecture that survived was destroyed or repurposed. The adults vanished. The children were scattered. The history was rewritten. Such coordination is far beyond coincidence. So the question arises again, who benefited? To answer this, we must look at the timing of the reset. The 1700s and 1800s were centuries of massive transformation. New empires rose with astonishing speed. Old kingdoms fell quietly. Technologies appeared in bursts, as if arriving from nowhere, attributed to inventors whose pasts are strangely vague. Borders shifted. Languages standardized. Entire systems of measurement replaced older ones overnight. It is as if the world was reorganized. The industrial age exploded out of the wreckage. Nations that had once been small or fractured grew into global powers almost immediately after Tartaria vanished from the maps. In places where Tartarian architecture once stood, new governments took root. These new powers claimed they had built the structures themselves, even when the timelines did not support the claim. They insisted that all the engineering marvels belonged to them. Yet their own records show confusion. Architects in the 19th century often wrote that they did not know how certain structures had been built. Engineers commented on bridges and domes they claimed were too advanced for their time. Politicians spoke of taking possession of cities that already existed rather than constructing them. Explorers recorded finding settlements with no adult population but well-built infrastructure. This pattern suggests that what researchers call the reset did not simply erase Tartaria. It created space for a new world to rise quickly, using the remnants of the old world as its foundation. But how could such a reset occur? There are several theories, none of them simple, all of them unsettling. The first theory suggests that the reset was the result of a natural catastrophe on a global scale, a massive seismic event, a chain of volcanic eruptions, an atmospheric collapse, a shift in the Earth's crust, something so vast that it destabilized the environment across continents. Such events can kill adults while sparing children, especially if the mechanism involves atmospheric pressure, toxic gases, or sound frequencies. If this were the case, The disappearance of adults could be explained by environmental vulnerability related to body size or lung capacity. Children may have survived because they were small enough to withstand the pressure changes. The second theory is far more complex. It proposes that Tartaria possessed a form of energy technology that relied on acoustic or atmospheric resonance. If this system experienced a catastrophic failure, it could have created a wave of destructive force across the region. This could explain the buried architecture, the missing adults, and the disoriented children. A malfunction in a civilization-wide energy network could collapse cities and disrupt the environment without leaving traditional signs of war. This theory is supported by the strange memories children carried. Memories of humming towers, vibrating air, and sudden pressure changes. The third theory is the most difficult to contemplate. It suggests intentional intervention. That somewhere in the world, a group or power saw Tartaria as a threat. That Tartaria's technology, its influence, or its worldview conflicted with the ambitions of emerging empires. If an opposing power sought to dominate the coming centuries, eliminating a rival civilization would offer a clear strategic advantage. The silence in historical records, the rapid rise of new nations, and the coordinated destruction of Tartarian structures could all point toward deliberate erasure. But if intentional, the reset required a mechanism so powerful that it could act across oceans. A mechanism capable of burying cities, altering the atmosphere, and removing adult populations simultaneously. No known technology can achieve this. Yet the world that emerged after the reset inherited technologies and ideas that seemed strangely advanced for their time. Electrical systems, architectural methods, industrial machinery. These developments appeared with suspicious speed, often with no clear lineage. It is almost as if the new world inherited fragments of Tartarian knowledge repackaged under new names. This raises another question. If the reset was intentional, who carried it out? Some point to rising global powers in the 1700s, others to secret societies or intellectual movements. A few suggest the involvement of forces not recorded in human history at all. What is certain is that whoever benefited from the disappearance of Tartaria ensured that its memory did not survive. Maps were altered, books rewritten, structures demolished, language standardized, and the children, the only witnesses, were folded into new societies without their past. The reset did not only destroy, it replaced. It created a world where history began with the industrial age. A world where older systems were forgotten. A world where new rulers could claim that nothing existed before them. This is why the Tartarian story is not just about the past. It is about the way the present was built. The foundations of our world rest on the ruins of a civilization we are not permitted to remember. But one thing remains puzzling. If the reset was meant to erase everything, why did the children survive? Why leave behind the living fragments of the very civilization that was supposed to be forgotten? There are two possibilities. The first is simple. The children were never meant to survive, but nature protected them. Perhaps their physiology shielded them. Perhaps they were too young to be affected by the mechanisms that removed the adults. The second is more unsettling. Perhaps the children were allowed to survive. Perhaps a new world requires innocence. Individuals with no memory of the past, easily shaped into future citizens. Perhaps the reset was not meant to eliminate humanity, but to replace its foundation. If so, the children were not only survivors, they were seeds planted in the soil of a rebuilt world. What emerges from this idea is not only a story of loss, but a story of transformation. Tartaria did not simply die. It was overwritten. Its people were scattered. Its architecture repurposed. Its knowledge fragmented, and its history buried. But the final truth of this reset can only be understood by tracing the lives of the children who survived it. Children who became the ancestors of millions living today. And in the last chapter of this journey, we draw the fragments together. We uncover what history never told us, and we face the silence that has shaped our world. Every story has an end, but not every truth is allowed one. Some truths drift in the space between memory and myth, held together by fragments scattered across centuries. Tartaria is one of those truths. A civilization erased, not through decay, but through silence. A silence so large that it swallowed continents, people, and the very idea of the past. Now, after following the traces left behind by the children, the buried cities, the ruined architecture, the underground tales, and the shattered timeline, a single question remains. What happened to Tartaria, and why were we never told? The official version of history begins only a few hundred years ago. Before that, the record grows thin, unreliable, or strangely inconsistent. Entire populations appear and vanish without explanation. Maps shift. Dates change. Technologies emerge too quickly, as if inherited rather than invented. New nations rise on foundations they did not build. When we pull at the edges of these inconsistencies, we find Tartaria. A world that left behind architecture too advanced for its era, engineering too precise, and a footprint too large to dismiss. Its collapse left behind children scattered across cities they did not recognize, and memories of a world that should not have existed. The mud flood buried the structures of Tartaria. The reset buried its people. History buried its memory. What remains are fragments, but fragments are enough. In the Orphan trains, we find the last survivors of a civilization whose adults vanished. Children who remembered white cities, humming towers, and a world swallowed by earth. In their drawings, we find symbols and shapes that match architectural motifs thousands of miles away. In their nightmares, we find the echo of a catastrophe no textbook describes. In the World's Fairs, we find the repackaged remnants of Tartarian architecture, displayed to the public under a different name, then destroyed before questions could form. A final glimpse of the old world, recast as a temporary fantasy of the new. In the ruins of San Francisco, we find bones in the wrong layers of history, objects made from unknown metals, and structures buried long before the city was built, evidence of a past that clashed with the timeline we were given. In the legends of the Green Children, we find the first distant memory of young survivors emerging from the shadows of collapse, echoes of a pattern that would repeat centuries later. In the missing adults, we find the silence at the center of the story, a silence created by a mechanism, natural, accidental, or deliberate, that removed an entire generation, leaving behind only those too young to understand what they had witnessed. All of these threads point to a single conclusion. Tartaria was not a myth, not a mistake, not a misunderstanding. It was a world erased. But erasure does not remove existence, it only removes recognition, and recognition is beginning to return. We do not know who or what initiated the reset. We do not know why the adults were lost. We do not know how an event could bury buildings across continents. But we know this: children survived. And because they survived, fragments of Tartaria survived as well. Those fragments live on in the architecture we cannot explain, in the anomalies we are told to ignore, in the older maps that contradict the newer ones, in the folk stories dismissed as fantasy, in the technology that arrived too early, in the ground that hides too much beneath it, and in the memories of those who were never meant to remember. The world we live in was built on the ashes of another, a world of white cities and great towers, a world whose knowledge brushed the edge of natural forces we barely understand today, a world whose disappearance reshaped history so thoroughly that most people never question its absence. But the echoes remain. They remain in the buried floors beneath our feet, in the ruins that rise out of rivers after storms, in the foundations uncovered during construction, in the stories of strangers who claim to come from places no longer on the map, in the silence that falls when questions grow too large. History did not forget Tartaria. History buried it. What remains now is the decision of what to do with the fragments. The story of Tartaria does not ask us to believe in conspiracy or myth. It asks us to look at what has always been in front of us, to see the buried windows beneath modern streets, the ancient structures hidden behind newer facades, the towers that resemble antennae rather than decoration, the patterns children drew long before they could speak of them. And above all, it asks us to listen to the voices of the lost children, the true survivors of the reset. Their memories are the last map we have of the world before the silence. A world that once existed beyond the boundaries of our accepted history. A world that may yet exist in the spaces we have not learned to see. As this story closes, one truth becomes clear. We are not living at the beginning of history. We are living in its aftermath. And the world we call new is built on the ruins of a world we were never meant to remember. This is what history never told us. This is the echo of Tartaria's lost children. And this is the shadow of the world that came before. If you found this journey worth taking, consider liking the video, sharing it with someone curious, and subscribing to the channel so you never miss what we uncover next. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive.